Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael, Managing Editor for Politics at Bloomberg Opinion. Today, we're talking about the Trump administration's fight with American universities. And joining me to talk about that are two of our political columnists, Frances Wilkinson and Mary Ellen Claus. Thank you guys both for being here today. I thought we would just start with sort of bring us up to speed. There was a lot of developments over the weekend. There's new headlines out today. Frank, can you just hit the highlights for us of kind of what is going on here? How is the administration putting pressure on these universities?
Well, they're doing it in a variety of ways with a variety of institutions. The headlines are mostly about the sort of Ivy League elite institutions, the universities that we associate with liberalism and elitism. But let's start with Columbia in that regard, because that fits that mold. The universities are basically being told by the Trump administration that they have to change their policies on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They have to change their policies on trans athletes, of which there are not very many, but to the extent that there are. And even minute things, what the administration is going after Columbia on ostensibly is a result of the protests against the Gaza bombings by Israel, which were really badly handled by the Columbia administration, which then went on to give a very poor performance in front of congressional investigators. And so it was an easy target for them. So what they're demanding, and that Columbia has already agreed to do, is to place strictures on the Middle East Department, on the Palestine Studies Department, to give campus police more powers to arrest students. And in return for that, Columbia got nothing. The administration could just ratchet up new demands at any moment. And as we know from Donald Trump's history of behavior, he probably will do so, in a midnight tweet or something. And so the universities are basically being separated. They're not engaging in the kind of collective action that would allow them to fight this attack with more strength. There are certain universities, Princeton University's president has raised some protests about this, Wesleyan University in Connecticut, but it's really been a disparate response from universities. The Wesleyan president has tried to put a coalition together and said it was difficult. The law dean at Berkeley in California has tried to do the same, said it's very difficult. So we're seeing a lack of collective action from American universities. And we're seeing a, so far, pretty successful attack on universities to defund them and really introduce a level of chaos into the system, because, they've cut research funding for ongoing research projects that may be several years old. They've cut funding for new professors who thought they were coming in. So it's left a lot of universities in the lurch.
Yeah. So there's the holding hostage of this research funding, which I think in Columbia's case amounts to something like 20% of its budget. It's a huge
$400
amount.
million.
Yeah. And the pretexts are, as you said, the DEI policies, transgender athletes, and anti-Semitism. And I guess I'm just wondering, Mary Ellen, as you've been following this, is there anything you would kind of add to that overview? Anything that has struck you that you feel like is important to inject into our conversation today?
Well, I guess I am kind of stunned at the degree to which the Trump administration has injected these conditions. And the other thing that's come about over the weekend is Columbia's capitulation.
Yeah.
And that has to be, that just is, bone chilling in many ways. There is some pushback. I understand there was a protest of university professors yesterday, but it does seem as if the university sees that it has to just sort of go along, and and in order to kind of continue forward, maybe they'll mount some kind of a fight. But as Frank said, it's a disparate reaction, and there doesn't seem to be any broad outrage in a coordinated fashion.
Yeah. I have to say, I think one of the things that has sort of struck me is that you know, reeling in higher education in some way has been on the right wing wish list for a while. It was outlined pretty extensively in Project 2025. And at the state level, you know, governors in states like Texas and Florida have made a priority of this at the state level. And Mary Ellen, you've especially watched what's played out in Florida. So in a sense, this is happening now at the national level, but you had a front row seat to this as it sort of got tested through trial and error down in Florida.
Yeah, it's really been a very interesting thing. I have to admit, when this all started to happen in Florida, when Ron DeSantis decided that he wanted to use the power of the state to go against what he called woke liberalism and focus on first scrutinizing textbooks in elementary and high schools, and then going after higher education, and especially their diversity and equity programs and outreach into making sure that they had diverse, students and faculty. I thought this was a one-off, but it's now turned out to be the playbook that Trump is following, and it's really kind of remarkable. What we started to watch happen is DeSantis, passes this legislation that basically threatens college professors and universities with consequences if they include things like their personal point of view and teaching on race and certain ways of approaching gender in class. And the consequences were such that they actually could lose tenure and they could lose funding. And in one case, in New College of Florida's case, DeSantis just outright took over and brought in, replaced the president, brought in a whole new board of trustees, and is really trying to change that to make it an ideologically focused institution that is doing what he thinks is stopping woke. And the interesting thing is he didn't stop there. He has now replaced the board of trustees that oversees the University of West Florida, and appointed as the incoming chairman of that board a professor from the university from Boise State University in Idaho, who has some remarkable positions on women, to say the least. He's basically talked about how women really shouldn't be in higher education, and we really need to diminish female advancement and sort of elevate men, and specifically white men, and silence competing ideas. This is the guy that is now the new chairman of the board of trustees in one of the fourth largest university in the state, and I have to say it's getting some pushback. He unlike naming a new president, has to be confirmed by the state Senate. And this individual's name is Scott Yenner, and there have been protests on campus. But the most interesting thing is that the very red county commission in this part of Florida Panhandle has written an astounding letter, basically suggesting to the Senate that they should not confirm him, and basically say, we think this is going to interfere with the progress of this university. We think it'll result in enrollment declines, and it will start hurting jobs in our community. So that's the kind of, there is some pushback, and I think the Senate is listening, because at this point they're about a month, 3.5 weeks into their legislative session. There's really only about 5 weeks left, and they have not agended his confirmation. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, it's interesting too that the pushback takes the form of this could hurt jobs because a lot of the pushback to like the sort of pressure on universities nationwide has also taken that form. There's been a lot of, hey, a lot of this research helps pharma, a lot of this research helps the biotech sector, a lot of this research helps national security. And I am wondering, Frank, what you make of that. I mean, Business Week, for example, Bloomberg Business Week did a lot of they did a sit down with several college presidents who all kind of used that language of free markets and trying to explain what they do. Do you feel like that is the most robust defense that they could mount in this time, or do you feel like, what was your sort of reaction to that?
Well, I think we've moved beyond that, to be honest.
Mm,
Look, this is simply an authoritarian assault. And this is what authoritarian assaults consist of, right? What do they go after? They go after the press, they go after universities, they go after the sources of information. Because what you want to do is you want to control the information. Florida is a classic example of this with history books. Why are these people so obsessed with changing what is in history books and restricting what history children can read? Because they want to control information. So they don't want ideas that flow from that information to spread. That is why universities are a target. If you wanted to address transgender sports or you wanted to address anti-Semitism on campus, why would you defund Johns Hopkins, biomedical research facilities? Why would you take down the research facilities at Columbia University? These are disparate things. One is not the same as the other, right? So they are attacking sources of information that do not comply, do not comport with the way they want to portray the world. And the way they want to portray the world is usually inaccurate because propaganda has become an absolutely essential part of this administration. So, this is a battle that is much larger than university budgets, much larger than, classroom curricula. This is about information, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, because they're attacking. I mean, they're trying to arrest. You just put it up on the screen there. People associated with Georgetown, associated with Columbia, for having engaged in what we would call freedom of speech and freedom of assembly rights. So this is a really broad-based attack on American rights and on the capacity of universities and other information generating centers to present information freely to the public.
yeah. I mean, and that sounds unusual to Americans to think about, but you've talked with people in other countries who say in their country, this is what has happened. This is normal. I'm thinking of some of the interviews you've done with people from Hungary, for example.
Well, Hungary is a good example in part because some of Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader's own people, have helped Trump on Trump staff on Project 2025. Trump has had numerous discussions with Viktor Orban, and the blueprint that he's following, which is the same as in Florida, which is to these types of crackdowns, are very familiar to Hungarians. Viktor Orban, and this I think gets to the job piece of this, they would rather not have the jobs. Viktor Orban drove a university out of Budapest because he didn't want them producing information he didn't like. He didn't want them educating students in a way he didn't like. He would rather lose that economic activity in the biggest city in Hungary than he would have that information flowing. And that's the type of mentality that we're seeing here. Destroying actually the biomedical infrastructure, other infrastructure of the United States, which has been preeminent for decades in an effort to tamp down on information and the capacity to educate.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because some of the changes that Colombia has agreed to, just as table stakes to negotiate the restoration of the $400 million, apparently were things they were already thinking about. They were already thinking about beefing up campus police powers. They were already thinking about maybe having rules around masks at protests. But the one that really seems to have made the faculty and made observers concerned is this sort of putting into academic receivership a couple of their regional studies departments, because that really does go to the academic freedom issue. And I guess, Mary Ellen, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on this, because this seems different from, what I've been used to seeing for the last 20 years of people on the right saying, hey, universities should protect free speech. University of California, Berkeley is too liberal. They should do more to protect conservative speech. This seems different. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on kind of how this seems different from those previous complaints.
Well, the most fundamental difference is that instead of advancing First Amendment rights and free speech, this is the state imposing thought police on academic institutions, and they are not apologizing about it. They want to dictate and an ideological point of view, and the interesting thing about Florida is that when DeSantis passed his Stop Woke Act, and it had two pieces. One piece required that private companies couldn't use DEI in their training, and the other had this component as it relates to universities. And the court put a hold on both pieces, but thankfully, it happened. But when the federal court judge that originally wrote the first opinion to block this law in Florida, he literally started his first sentence of the opinion quoting George Orwell's 1984. And he basically called it positively dystopian. And he declared this kind of thought police action as, as doublespeak, because basically it allows professors to enjoy academic freedom, he said, so long as they express only those viewpoints of which the state approves. And as Frank was saying, that's what Hungary's done, and this is the direction the U.S. is going with these kind of policies and this kind of intimidation. And so, yes, it's a complete about face in First Amendment and free speech. It's diametrically opposed to any claim they ever made that they support free speech. And it really is injecting thought police into our institutions we talk about academic freedom. The point of academic freedom is to allow competing ideas and allow discussion and make it possible for students to critically think and engage. And you just can't get that if it's a one-way street, if the only kinds of ideas are directed by the state and no one can challenge it.
In some sense, I think I have been sort of thinking about universities as a target here, and sort of why politically they might make an attractive target, in addition to the points that you and Frank have raised. I think, I am beaming to you from the Boston area. We have a lot of universities here. I know a lot of people who work in universities, and it's clear, I think, to most of us in my city that the universities really support our tech and biotech and medical clusters here in the Boston area. But I think for most people, that is not their experience. Majority of Americans have never been to college. They don't have a degree. Even among Americans who have been to college, many feel that they had to pay way too much and take on way too much debt to get that degree. And that, in fact, the degree itself maybe is not that useful, that it was sort of necessary because universities are kind of gatekeepers to elite jobs, but that they didn't necessarily need to spend that vast amount of money to do a job that just involves, something that they didn't learn in school. So I'm wondering if you think that there is kind of a pattern here in terms of the first couple months of this administration of choosing targets that are kind of, for most Americans, not very sympathetic. And Frank, I think we'll start with you within this one.
Well, look, I mean, this is what Trumpism is, right? You have enemies and you attack your enemies, and you have friends and you protect your friends. His political coalition is not PhD candidates at Columbia. His political coalition is largely white, non-college educated, and especially males. So he's given that division is his means of communication, his means of politics, his means really of everything. His means of foreign policy. We have to attack Canada and Greenland now because, I don't know why, but he needs to be aggressive against everyone who's not in his coterie, right? So there is an us versus them quality to this. I don't think that, if you look at something that Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, has done, which is a very smart thing, which is to take a whole cast of jobs in the state and say, these used to require college education. So you used to have to have a college degree to get this job and work for the state. That's no longer the case. Policies like that make a lot of sense. That's not damaging people who do want to go to college. It's not damaging people who it's not damaging the information and the free speech of college. It's just saying you don't have to have a college degree to get these jobs. And why should you? If you're smart and you have a track record of accomplishment, why do you need a college degree? That's a very different set of policy considerations and loyalties, frankly, than saying, well, my guys are not college graduates and my guys are not college professors. So let's attack them because they produce a lot of information I don't like, and they also don't vote for me. That's a very different set of circumstances.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the other things here that seems to be escalating is we're getting more and more reports of the administration going after specific students. So there was the high profile example recently of Mahmoud Khalil, who we talked about a little bit on last week's stream with Noah Feldman, the legal issues there. But then just over the last 24 hours, there's been reports of another Columbia College student, maybe even two other ones, who have gone basically into hiding because they've learned that the government's trying to deport them. And these are people who are here legally and seem to have engaged in no crime. And all they have done is engage in their constitutionally protected powers of speech. So that sort of selecting of names and pursuing of names seems designed to have a chilling effect. And Mary Ellen, I am wondering, given that you've been following this for so long, is that something you've seen play out in Florida, or is this totally new? Is this not something that DeSantis had tried? Is this a totally new thing designed by Trump?
Well, I have to say, DeSantis has not gone after individuals with this kind of rigor, and I think that what Trump is doing is just the standard tool in his toolbox. He's going after people that he thinks will ignite some kind of outrage from people in his base, and it's not the idea that and he's using as cover, of course, that they're saying things against the state and against his position. And that's how he's gone after, that's his enemies list. And we have not watched DeSantis go after people in academia this way. What he has done is gone after state attorneys because they professed maybe opposition to his anti-abortion legislation and maybe suggested they don't agree with his focus on gun rights. And, they never acted in any way that didn't defend the law, but he perceived it as not being willing to defend law or his law that he wanted to pass. And so he went after them. So, it wasn't in academia, but yes, he went after individuals. So we've watched this.
It's interesting to me too that these students are using the legal process to defend themselves. And I, have to say they seem to me likely to win, given that this seems like a clear case of viewpoint discrimination. But it will be, which is not allowed. That's not allowed under the First Amendment. At the same time, it's going to be enormously expensive for them and their families to mount these defenses. And a university like Columbia or like Harvard or, any of these big private universities, they have massive endowments. They could have fought this. They seem to have chosen so far not to. And I'm wondering, what are you each watching next in terms of where you think this will go? Are more going to fall in line now that Columbia has capitulated? Or will that serve as actually kind of warning that galvanizes the other universities to try to maintain their independence from the government? Mary Ellen, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, well, I will tell you that I think that universities are in an enormously precarious position, and it's really unfortunate that they didn't see this storm coming, because I read some reporting that universities, essentially many of these Ivy League schools and high, some of the top universities in the country that are private in name only. When you look at the sponsored research at Harvard, I read that it was like 2/3 is sponsored by the federal government, 3/4 of the research at Stanford, half at Berkeley, half at the University of Wisconsin, which is a public institution. Same with Berkeley. But I do believe that there is a problem that they have created for themselves, and that they are so dependent on federal funding. And that's why the trade-off is, okay, we won't defend this particular student, but if we play nice with the administration, maybe our funds will return. And honestly, it's important for all of America to be aware of this, because this is valuable research they're doing. It's open research, it's shared research. That is not a feature of the kind of research that happens in the private sector. And so, I think the implications of all of this are enormous. And you in the biotech hub of the country, that is a very important place, especially now as we continue to have the threat of global pandemics.
Yes. Yeah. Frank, what are you watching for next as this fight unfolds?
Well, I just want to follow up. Mary Ellen made a really important point. This relationship between the federal government and these universities goes back to World War II. It has been a component of American prosperity for the last 80 years. It is the reason we have had great advancements in drug discovery and in biotech and in AI and in all of these other fields.
The internet, yeah,
yes,
a lot of this stuff.
The internet. So there's that component of it. But let's look at, you cited the individual students. All of them were non-white, right? That's not a coincidence. This is part of a sustained attack that the Trump administration is making on a part of American society that they have decided is their enemy and that they're going to crush. So what does that tell us about where they go next? It's an attack on civil society that will be more than universities. We're already seeing it with law firms, right? You're not allowed to represent people we don't like. You're not allowed to say words we don't like. They're telling to these students, right? This is a broad-based assault, and it will continue until Americans make it stop. And I don't know when that's going to be. I don't think it's going to, people who are relying on the courts or relying on Congress are going to be very disappointed, I think. This is going to come down to American people, citizens, doing their own due diligence about what this assault is really about and standing up to it. And when that happens, I don't know. I'd like it to be sooner rather than later.
All right. Thank you both for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who watched. This has been a Bloomberg Opinion live stream, and we will see you again soon.